A U.S. Marine finds a frozen German shepherd begging him toward the woods where a cry still echoes. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. He finds her just past the old timber road, where the snowfall stacks in thin, brittle layers, each one holding a bit of last night's cold. The sky is a washed-out silver, the kind that makes the world feel quieter than it should. Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer steps out of his truck, boots sinking a few inches into the crusted snow, breath lifting in slow, pale threads. He wasn't supposed to stop here. He wasn't supposed to hear anything except the hum of his engine fading behind him. But something in the stillness tugs at him. Something small, thin, almost like a breath caught in the trees. Then he sees her. A German shepherd, fur stiff with frost, stands trembling beside a bent mile marker. Her paws press into the snow like she's afraid it might swallow her. She doesn't bark. She doesn't retreat. She only lifts her head toward him, amber eyes cloudy with exhaustion, yet carrying a kind of quiet plea. A single step forward. Then she looks back into the woods. Another step. Then she looks at him again, as if begging him to understand. Dan slows, hands open at his sides, speaking softly to the cold air around them. She isn't asking for warmth. She isn't asking for safety. Every shiver in her body says she needs something deeper, something hidden beneath the hush of the morning. A faint sound drifts through the pines. He can't tell if it's wind or memory or something alive fighting to be heard. The shepherd hears it for him. Her ears twitch. Her body tightens. She turns again toward the tree line, her breath breaking in small, white bursts. Dan feels the pull now too, like a thread tightening between them. He takes another step, snow cracking softly underfoot. The dog's legs tremble, but she holds her ground until she's sure he's following. Only then does she turn and move toward the shadows, leaving a trail of fragile prints in the snow. And in that fragile stillness, Dan realizes something simple and heavy. Whatever waits in those woods hasn't stopped calling, and she hasn't stopped listening. The air thickens as Daniel Mercer follows the shepherd toward the tree line, the snow shifting from a soft dust to sharper crystals that nip at his face. The quiet feels heavier here, like the forest is holding its breath. A thin breeze slips through the pines, carrying the faint scent of cold bark and something older, something almost forgotten. Dan adjusts the collar of his jacket, feeling the sting of the morning wind trace across the scar on his cheek. Each step presses deeper into untouched powder, the kind that squeaks lightly under his boots. Ahead of him, the shepherd slows, her body still trembling, but her determination never fading. She stops once, glances back at him with those tired amber eyes, and then nudges her nose toward the dim path curling between the trees. It is not a trail meant for walking, just a narrow seam where the snow settles thinner beneath leaning branches. The shepherd steps into it anyway, leaving behind tiny indentations that look too fragile to belong to a creature that has fought so hard to stand. Dan follows, lifting low branches gently so they do not brush her weakened frame. The cold settles deeper the farther they go, shifting from surface chill to something that sinks into bone. His breath forms steady white clouds, each one rising quickly and vanishing as if swallowed by the forest itself. A faint sound pulses again, carried between the trunks. It is not clear enough to name, yet not faint enough to ignore. It wavers like a memory trying to push its way back into the world. Dan pauses, tilting his head slightly. The shepherd freezes too, her ears lifting, her body tightening as though the sound threads directly into her heartbeat. For a moment, Dan wonders if he imagined it, some echo of an earlier life, a distant call from nights spent in mountains not unlike these. But the shepherd hears it again. Her paw shifts forward. Just one. Then she looks at him. It is a look stripped of everything except need. Dan exhales slowly, letting the forest fill the silence around them. He senses something in the air, something that feels almost like expectation. The kind of stillness that comes before small miracles or small heartbreaks. The trees thicken around them, their branches interlocking overhead until the sky becomes a thin gray ribbon. Snow drifts from the needles in light showers each time the wind touches them. The shepherd stumbles once, catching herself with a shaky breath, but she does not stop. Dan moves closer, ready to lift her if she collapses, but she presses onward with surprising resolve. Then the sound comes again, clearer this time. A soft cry, thin as a thread, stretching from somewhere deeper inside the woods. It hums through the air, trembles against the bark, and settles inside Dan's chest. The shepherd raises her head, as if to confirm what he already knows. Something alive is waiting. Something small. Something afraid. The wind quiets for a moment, as though giving space for the truth to settle. Dan steps forward, muscles bracing against the cold, and the shepherd walks beside him now instead of ahead. Two shadows moving toward a single echo, guided not by certainty, but by a fragile hope neither of them can ignore. The forest narrows until the world feels stitched together by branches and breath, each sound softened by the weight of snow that clings to the pines. Daniel Mercer slows his steps, not from fear, but from the strange certainty that whatever waits ahead needs quiet, not haste. The shepherd walks close to his leg now, her trembling more controlled, as if being near him lends her a strength she has been holding on to by threads. A thin beam of light presses through the branches as the morning sun rises higher, turning the frost on her fur into tiny crystals that shimmer with every careful step she takes. Dan watches her for a moment, noticing the way she presses her nose to the ground, then lifts it again toward the deeper woods. It is not direction. It is devotion. She knows where she is going. She just needs him to follow. The faint cry returns, stretching across the still air, softer this time but clearer, as if the woods themselves are guiding it toward them. It is not a sharp sound. It is round, fragile, shaped by cold air and something small trying to breathe against. Winter's grasp. Dan feels it settle in his chest, a weight both painful and tender. Memories flicker at the edge of his mind, moments from winters spent in uniform, nights spent listening for voices that never returned. He lets those thoughts drift away as another cry trembles through the trees. The shepherd stops beside a fallen log, her ears tilting forward. Dan crouches, brushing his glove across the snow-dusted bark. The cold bites through the thick fabric, reminding him just how long this little life has probably been out here. The shepherd lifts her paw and gently taps the log, then looks toward a narrow space where the trunk has split open near the roots. Snow has gathered there in uneven piles, forming a small pocket of shadow. Dan leans closer, careful not to disturb anything, his breath warming a faint circle in the air before fading again. Another sound rises. Faint, quivering, alive. The shepherd presses her muzzle closer, releasing a small whine, not loud enough to startle, just enough to reassure. Dan feels something inside him shift, a quiet ache he has carried since long before this morning. He brushes back a cluster of snow, moving slowly so the cold does not collapse into the small hollow beneath. The air changes, warmer by only the slightest margin, but enough to tell him this space has been fought for by a creature trying to protect something precious. The shepherd rests her chin on the log, her eyes softening as she watches him. Her tail makes one small, hopeful sweep across the snow. Dan steadies his breath. He has been here before in different forms, moments where the world holds its balance on the edge of something fragile and waiting. He reaches forward again, brushing aside another thin layer of frost, revealing more of the hollow. The cry comes once more, weaker now, but undeniably there. A small life tucked inside winter's grasp. The shepherd lets out a soft exhale, as if offering her trust into his hands. Dan meets her gaze for a moment, giving a slow nod, then turns his attention back to the dark space beneath the log where hope is trying, once again, to survive. Daniel Mercer reaches deeper into the hollow, cupping his hands to shield whatever small warmth might still linger inside. The air feels different here, softened by the faintest rise of breath. That should not exist in a morning this cold. Snowflakes drift from the branches above, melting the instant they touch his gloves, as if even winter understands this quiet moment needs gentleness. The shepherd inches closer, her body brushing lightly against his knee for balance. She lets out a soft whine, not of fear, but of encouragement, urging him to keep going. Her breath forms small clouds that cling to the cold air, fading slowly like whispers. Dan lowers his face toward the hollow, steadying his breathing so he does not stir the fragile pocket of stillness beneath the roots. A soft warmth touches the tip of his glove, barely there, but enough to send a small rush through his chest. He feels movement, subtle and trembling, like a heartbeat fighting to stay within the world. The shepherd presses her paw gently against the side of the log, her eyes never leaving his hands. Her expression carries a kind of hope that feels too heavy for her weakened frame, yet she holds it anyway. Dan shifts some loose snow aside, careful not to let any of it fall into the hollow. The ground below is uneven, packed with leaves and bits of broken bark that form a small nest. In the center, tucked against a curve in the roots, lies a tiny bundle of fur barely larger than his palm. Its small chest rises in quick, uneven breaths, each one sounding like the softest echo of life clinging to a thread. The cry he heard earlier trembles from the little shape, thin and broken, but real. Dan's breath catches as he brings both hands closer. He keeps his voice low, speaking softly as if talking to the cold morning itself. The shepherd watches every movement, her ears lifting when the small creature stirs again. She lowers her head until her nose touches Dan's arm, as though reminding him that she is here, that this is her little one, that she has trusted him with the most precious part of her world. Dan slowly gathers the tiny pup into his hands, feeling the faint heat against his palms. The pup is incredibly light, almost weightless, its fur damp from the melted snow. The cold has crept far too close to its fragile body, and Dan can feel the urgency settle in his chest. He draws the pup close to his jacket, letting his own warmth create a small barrier against the winter air. The shepherd gently nudges the pup with her nose, releasing a soft, trembling breath that carries more relief than sound. Dan looks at her, understanding passing between them without a word. She did everything she could. She held on. She waited. And now she is asking him to help her finish what she started. Dan stands slowly, cradling the pup while the shepherd stays pressed close to his leg. The woods around them feel different now, less silent, less empty. The echo that led them here has quieted, replaced by something small and real moving against his chest. Dan adjusts his hold on the pup, glancing at the shepherd who lifts her head with a strength that seems to grow from the hope she has reclaimed. For the first time that morning, Dan feels the world shift, not with fear or loss, but with the soft beginnings of something fragile finding its way back to life. Daniel Mercer adjusts the pup gently against his chest, feeling its tiny breaths flutter in uneven rhythms against the fabric of his jacket. The cold presses in from every direction, but the fragile warmth beneath his hands reminds him that time is no longer something he can spare. The shepherd leans into his leg, her body still trembling from exhaustion, yet her eyes glow with a quiet determination that seems to rise from something deeper than strength. She steps forward, nudging Dan toward the path with a small push of her shoulder, as if reminding him that this moment is not a place to linger. Dan gives a slow nod, shifting his stance in the snow. The forest around them softens into a muted blur of white and dark bark, each tree standing like a witness to the fragile life he now carries. A soft breeze moves through the branches overhead, brushing the frost from the needles in a gentle fall that glitters for a moment before disappearing into the cold ground. He breathes in deeply, letting the crisp air steady his thoughts, then begins to walk. The shepherd matches his pace, her paws leaving uncertain prints in the snow alongside his larger, firmer steps. Her legs still wobble, but she moves with a quiet urgency, guided by instinct and love rather than strength. Dan keeps the pup tucked close beneath his jacket, shielding it from the wind. Each time it exhales a faint, warm puff against the fabric, a small wave of reassurance moves through him. The sound that guided them earlier has faded now, replaced by the soft rhythm of two creatures fighting to stay connected in a world that can turn cold without warning. As they move farther from the hollow, the trees begin to spread apart. Shafts of pale morning light slip between the branches, touching the snow in faint glimmers. The shepherd pauses once, lowering her head to sniff the ground, her breath forming a small cloud that hovers before dissolving. Her tail lifts in a slow, hopeful arc, as if the world is beginning to open again. Dan kneels beside her, placing one hand gently on her back while supporting the pup with the other. He feels the tremor in her muscles, the exhaustion tugging at her frame. Yet beneath it all he senses a quiet resilience, the kind that only forms when love has been tested in the cold. He whispers a soft reassurance, not for her to hear with her ears, but for her to feel in the space between them. She lifts her head slightly, pressing her nose to his wrist in a gesture so small and heartfelt that it anchors him more than the ground beneath his knees. Slowly he rises, continuing toward the distant break in the trees where his truck waits. The snow crunches underfoot in a familiar rhythm, steady and sure, almost like a promise. The pup shifts slightly, finding a more comfortable place against his warmth. Each tiny movement reminds Dan of the delicate line separating loss from hope, and how easily it can tilt with just one breath, one step, one act of quiet courage. The shepherd walks closer now, brushing her side against his leg with gentle persistence. Together they move through the pale morning, not speaking, not rushing, simply holding onto the fragile thread of life they have been entrusted with. And in the hush of the winter woods, it feels as though the world leans in a little closer, giving them the grace of one small miracle at a time. Daniel Mercer feels the weight of the tiny pup pressed against his chest grow softer, its breath still steady but thin, like a candle flame trying to hold itself upright against the winter air. The shepherd stays close to his side as they approach the edge of the woods, her steps slow but purposeful, as though every part of her understands that she has brought her little one as far as she could alone. The sky above begins to brighten, letting a pale ribbon of light stretch across the snow. Dan can hear the faint hum of the wind moving through the open field beyond the trees, a gentler sound than the whispers of the forest. It reminds him that the world is larger than this frozen stretch, that hope sometimes waits just outside the shadows. He adjusts the pup beneath his jacket, pulling the zipper slightly higher to keep the warmth in. The small heartbeat thumps softly against his palm, a fragile reminder that they are not past danger yet. The shepherd lifts her head, scanning the open clearing ahead, her breath forming a thin mist that drifts away like a quiet sigh. Her ears tilt forward at the distant shape of his truck sitting alone on the roadside, its windows frosted, its black paint softened by a thin layer of morning snow. Dan steps onto the firmer ground of the clearing, feeling the change in terrain beneath his boots. The snow here is shallower, easier to navigate. The shepherd's paws sink less deeply, and she moves with a touch more confidence, as if the open space gives her the courage her tired legs struggle to hold. Halfway across the clearing, the pup stirs against his chest, making a faint, soft sound that is more breath than voice. Dan places a steadying hand over its small body, feeling the tiny ribs rise and fall. He knows the signs of cold slipping too close. He has seen it before in places far from here, places that looked nothing like this gentle winter morning. The shepherd slows beside him, leaning her shoulder against his leg. She lifts her muzzle toward the pup, brushing her nose lightly against the fabric of his jacket. The gesture is tender, almost reverent, a small assurance that she is still here, still fighting for the life she brought into the world. Dan lowers a hand to her head, letting his fingers glide gently over her ears. Her fur is cold, but beneath it he feels the warmth of trust that has grown between them in such a short time. It anchors him as much as the ground beneath his feet. With the truck just a short distance ahead, Dan quickens his steps slightly. The shepherd follows, her breath coming in soft, rhythmic puffs that drift behind her. The sun catches on her fur, revealing the faint shimmer of frost that clings to her coat, turning her into a moving silhouette of determination. As they reach the truck, Dan carefully settles the pup in the passenger seat, wrapping it in a thick emergency blanket he keeps for winter drives. The small creature curls instinctively, its tiny body sinking into the warmth. The shepherd lifts her front paws onto the seat, leaning in to nuzzle her pup with a tenderness that pulls at something deep inside Dan's chest. He watches her for a moment, letting the quiet scene settle into his memory. The fragile breaths, the soft nudge of a mother's nose, the thin morning light stretching across snow that has carried them through the coldest part of their journey. Dan gently helps the shepherd into the truck, guiding her with careful hands. She settles beside the blanket, her body curved protectively around her pup, her eyes soft with a relief that radiates through the small space. Dan closes the door, takes a slow breath, and walks around to the driver's seat. The cold still clings to the air, but something inside the truck has already begun to thaw. Daniel Mercer starts the engine, and the truck rumbles to life with a low, steady vibration that warms the cold air inside the cabin. The heater begins to push out soft breaths of warmth, slowly replacing the sharp chill that has followed them from the woods. The shepherd curls her body protectively around the tiny pup, her nose tucked close as if counting every small rise of its fragile chest. Dan watches them for a moment, letting the sight settle into him the way sunlight settles onto frost, melting something he did not realize had been frozen. He adjusts the temperature dial a little higher and pulls back onto the quiet country road, tires crunching lightly over the thin layer of snow that coats the asphalt. The morning light stretches across the horizon in long, pale bands, guiding them toward town with a gentle glow that feels almost like a blessing. Dan keeps one hand on the wheel and lets the other rest. Near the shepherd, close enough for her to sense his presence. She lifts her head slightly, her eyes warm but tired, the kind of tired that comes from giving everything she had to protect the life now wrapped in the soft blanket beside her. The pup moves faintly, pressing closer into the fold of warmth created by its mother's chest. A small sound escapes it, not quite a whine, more like a sigh. The shepherd lowers her nose to the pup's head, touching it with a tenderness so instinctive and pure that it quiets the air inside the truck. Dan feels the moment settle into the space between them. He thinks of the long nights he spent listening for breath in places where silence meant something different, something heavier. Yet here, in the small cab of an old truck, silence carries hope instead of fear. The road curves through the edge of town, where a few early risers scrape frost from their windshields, and the scent of wood smoke drifts from chimneys. The warmth in the truck grows stronger, and Dan watches as a faint ripple of life begins to return to the pup's tiny body. Its breaths deepen slightly, steadier than before. The shepherd sees it too. She shifts just enough to curl a little closer, her tail giving a single slow sweep across the seat. Dan turns into the parking lot of the small animal clinic, where a soft, glowing sign hangs above the door. The place has a familiar comfort to it, the kind of building that seems to hold more stories of healing than any one person knows. As he parks, the shepherd lifts her head fully for the first time since the woods. Her eyes follow his movements closely, trusting but alert, as if making sure he understands the weight of what she is giving him. Dan lowers the tailgate and opens the passenger door carefully. Cold air rushes in, swirling around the warmth they created inside. He lifts the pup gently, keeping the blanket secure around its tiny body. The shepherd steps down beside him, her paws touching the ground with renewed strength. She stays close, her shoulder brushing his leg as they walk together toward the clinic entrance. With each step, the rising sun paints the snow in faint gold, lighting their path with quiet grace. Dan pauses at the door, glancing down. At the shepherd, she meets his eyes, steady and sure, as if telling him that this is the moment she has fought toward through every trembling step, every breath held against the cold. He nods once, a silent promise passing between them. Then he pushes the door open, carrying the fragile hope in his arms, with the shepherd walking faithfully at his side. The warm light inside the small clinic settles over Daniel Mercer like a gentle hand, easing the cold from his shoulders as the door closes behind them. The shepherd stays close to his leg, her soft steps whispering across the clean tile floor, while her eyes follow every motion of the tiny pup wrapped securely in the blanket Dan carries. The receptionist calls quietly for help, and within moments a veterinarian steps out from a side room, her expression shifting the instant she sees the fragile bundle in Dan's arms. She leads them toward an exam table near a wall of softly humming machines, the kind that fill a room with a sense of steady reassurance. Dan lays the pup down gently, keeping his hand close as the veterinarian begins her careful assessment. The shepherd rises onto her hind legs slightly, resting her front paws on the edge of the table, watching every movement with a gaze full of hope and fear woven together. The veterinarian lifts a stethoscope, holding it lightly against the pup's chest. The room grows quiet, almost reverent. Dan holds his breath without realizing it, listening for something he cannot hear. After a long moment, The veterinarian meets his eyes with a small, steady nod. The pup's heartbeat is faint, but present. The shepherd exhales sharply, a soft sound that trembles with relief. She lowers her head and places her nose near her pup's tiny ear, as if whispering encouragement into the little life that nearly slipped away. Dan feels something warm spread through his chest, something that reaches deep into a place he thought winter had taken from him long ago. The veterinarian explains in a calm, gentle voice that the pup needs warmth, fluids, and rest, but she believes there is a real chance for recovery. She works with practiced care, placing a tiny warming pad beneath the pup and wrapping it in fresh linens that hold a gentle, steady heat. The shepherd watches each step, her eyes never once leaving her little one. She presses her chin onto the edge of the table, her breath forming a faint circle of fog against the cold metal. When the veterinarian finishes, she steps back to give them space. Dan rests a hand on the shepherd's back, feeling her body soften under his touch. Her trembling has eased, replaced by a quiet strength that grows the longer she watches her pup breathe. The room fills with the subtle hum of the warming unit, its gentle vibrations creating a tender rhythm, almost like a lullaby for the tiny creature nestled in its blankets. Dan looks down at the pup, then at the shepherd, seeing the fragile thread that connects them. It is thin, but unbroken, a small miracle stitched into the morning. The veterinarian returns with a cup of warm water for the shepherd and hands Dan a blanket for her as well. He helps her onto a soft mat on the floor beside the table, where she lies down with her head angled upward so she can keep the pup in her sight. Her eyes soften, glowing with a kind of quiet gratitude that needs no words. Dan kneels beside her, resting his hand gently on her shoulder, feeling the warmth of her trust seep into his palm. In the stillness of the clinic, surrounded by soft light and steady breaths, he realizes that they have stepped across an invisible line. From cold to warmth, from fear to hope, from almost losing something to witnessing it begin again. The soft glow of the clinic's morning light settles into a warmer hue as time passes, wrapping the small room in a tenderness that feels almost sacred. Daniel Mercer stays close to the shepherd, his hand resting on her back as she lies on the cushioned mat beside the exam table, her eyes fixed on the tiny pup nestled in its nest of heated blankets. The pup's breaths grow steadier, each inhale a little deeper than the last, each exhale a faint whisper of life returning. The veterinarian moves quietly in the background, adjusting the warming pad and checking the pup's temperature, her presence gentle enough not to disturb the fragile calm. The shepherd follows every movement with unwavering attention, her ears tilting forward, her gaze softening whenever the pup shifts beneath the blankets. Dan watches her, seeing something in her expression that feels familiar, something he once carried himself in places far from here. A fierce devotion, a silent courage, a willingness to stand between life and cold, even when her own strength was fading. He lowers his hand to her front paw, letting his fingers rest lightly against the pads worn from the long night she spent fighting the winter alone. She responds with a slow lift of her head, pressing her nose gently into his palm. It is a gesture so quiet and full of trust that it leaves a small ache in his chest. Minutes stretch into a peaceful rhythm, marked only by the soft hum of machines and the steady breathing of mother and pup. Dan glances toward the window, where the rising sun spills its early light across the snow-covered street. The warmth of the day has begun to touch the world outside, melting the frost on the glass pane in delicate streaks. When he looks back at the shepherd, he finds her watching him with a calm he has not seen before. She shifts slightly, lowering her body until she rests fully against his leg, as if anchoring herself to the person who carried her through the coldest parts of the morning. The veterinarian approaches quietly, placing a light hand on Dan's shoulder. She tells him the pup is stabilizing, that the worst of the danger seems to have passed. The shepherd releases a gentle breath, almost like a soft thank you carried on the warm air. Dan feels something inside him ease, a part of him that had been held tight for far too long. He looks down at the shepherd, and she lifts her eyes to meet his, giving a slow blink that holds a depth he does not try to name. Instead, he simply rests his hand on her head, letting the quiet moment speak for both of them. The veterinarian steps away, giving them privacy as the room returns to its tender stillness. The pup shifts again beneath the blankets, stretching one tiny paw toward the light. The shepherd lifts her head, touching her nose to the edge of the linens, reassuring her little one with the softest breath. Dan watches the scene unfold, feeling the warmth of it settle deeply inside him. In this quiet morning, surrounded by soft light and two fragile lives that refuse to give up, he understands something simple and profound. Sometimes the world does not shout its blessings. Sometimes it whispers them in the form of trembling paws, faint cries, and the courage to keep walking through the cold. He gathers the shepherd gently against his side, knowing she has found a place beyond survival. A place where hope is not something distant, but something she can touch with her own heart. And as the sun rises higher, filling the clinic with a soft, forgiving glow, Dan realizes that he has found that place too.